Hello, everybody. This is Kyrix, and I'm here with something a little more somber than usual. As you may or may not have known, Leonard Nimoy died recently uh, from, I believe, complications to COPD from when he smoked in his youth. And I'm not here to talk about, what Leonard Nimoy's career was like, or what kind of things he did early in life or later in life. There are sites all over the internet that'll give you an objective summary of who Leonard Nimoy was. The whole purpose of making a video like this is, what did Leonard Nimoy mean to me? Now, I don't know if it's come up. Well, if you've been watching This Week in Kyrix, it's come up that I am a big Star Trek fan. And to be fair, I was originally going to make a video like this, and I'm like, no, rather than make a video, I'll drop it in This Week in Kyrix, and I promptly forgot, and that makes me something of an asshole. So here's the video that I should have made when it happened, which is just, who was Leonard Nimoy to me? What was Leonard Nimoy to me? Now, first off, I am not quite old enough to have really seen Star Trek. I may have caught a rerun or two when I was a child, and I do have the vaguest of memories of seeing the animated series on Nickelodeon. I know definitely commercials, and I might have watched the actual show as well. So Star Trek was a thing when I was a kid. It still was. I don't know if the Next Generation was out yet, but I know the animated series is still on Nickelodeon. I knew who Spock was, I knew who Kirk was, and I knew who Scotty was, but nobody else. Didn't know who the Klingons were, or the Romulans, or Uhura, or Chekhov, or Sulu, or even McCoy, but I knew Spock, I knew Scotty, and I knew Kirk. And, of course, when I started showing interest in Star Trek, my grandmother, who is also not around, who I love dearly, would tape me everything. She recorded everything that I ever watched, There was a time before Mommy would throw them out where I had tapes of just basically everything I ever watched in my childhood. And she would tape movies for me, too. And among those movies were the Star Trek movies before there were any Next Generation. And I had limited attention for them when I was a child. Like, I had The Undiscovered Country for close to a decade before I ever really sat down and watched it. And I never got into the Wrath of Khan or Search for Spock or the motion picture, because to me there was just something stuffy and old about those as a child. And as an adult, I'm still not as into the Wrath of Khan as every other one. I don't see what the fuss is about. I mean, I understand it's a movie. I do enjoy the movie, but for everyone like, oh, this is the movie by which all of the Star Treks are measured, my response is, couldn't you have picked a better movie than that? Because I just don't see what this magical thing of. Maybe it was because it was the first movie that had a villain, you know? But as good as Khan was, I think Chang was a better villain. Because when Khan came on the scene, you knew he was a villain. When Chekhov realized where he was, his immediate response was not, oh, it's Khan, maybe he'll talk to me. It's like, oh shit, it's Khan, I'm dead. With General Chang, he was something of an ally-ish. I mean, he was a Klingon, of course, and they were ostensibly enemies. But you didn't get the immediate sense that this was all his masterminded plan, you know, which it was. And he was a good villain on top of that. And he had the whole cultured villain thing that Khan did, except he wasn't batshit crazy. And I'm drifting off topic. I know this is about Leonard Nimoy, not about Star Trek. Well, not about Star Trek in general, but I'm setting the point here that those are the movies I had as a child, and I had all six of them. I think The Final Frontier was the last one I got, but that's neither here nor there. But I had them, and I didn't really watch them until much later in life. And I grew up with a lot of the Next Generation when I finally got into Star Trek around the third or fourth grade. And it would be years before I got full exposure to Star Trek, the original series, because it wasn't on TV. That didn't come till much later, when it came back to television on the Sci-Fi Channel. But what happened was, I still had exposure to a lot of the things, like the Vulcan salute, which I'm literally, as I mention it, doing it right now, even though I'm not face camming and you can't see. You have to take my word for it, but I can do it naturally now. I just put my hands up and bam, there it is. The story of how I did that was interesting. I'd seen it on TV. I was watching Channel 44 or Channel 4. Maybe it was WTOG, maybe it was UPN, maybe it's whatever it is now if it's not UPN, but that's what it was at the time. And I was trying to do it, and I'm like, I can't make the gesture. So what I did was I got some scotch tape and taped my index finger and middle finger together, and taped my pinky and my ring finger together, and just moved the two middle fingers and held them apart until I could move them like that. And then gradually, over the period of about a year, I got it to the point where it was natural on one hand and then doable on the other. I can do it now, just bam, just look, double Vulcan salute. I'm more Vulcan than you. Deal with it, bitch. But that was the thing, and that was something Spock came up with. Not Spock. That was something Spock did that Nimoy came up with. And what was it? Nimoy was basically the original breakout character of Star Trek, because Spock was the only character that was in every iteration of the initial run through of the original series. I almost said the Next Generation, but he was in the pilot, The Cage, which I have seen, by the way, and he was in the real show, obviously, or else we wouldn't know who he was. But my first exposure to him as a character heavily was when I was in, let's say, 7th grade, and I got into Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm trying to look up D&D books, like the Monster Manual and the DMG and all that, and I didn't realize that the school library wouldn't carry them. It never occurred to me, because before then, every book I ever wanted could be found in the school library. So the idea that it wouldn't was kind of strange, but I did come up with other books, like the Monster Manual about movie monsters. And specifically, when I looked up Monster Manual, I found the monsters of Star Trek, and how do you not read a book like that? And it showed every creature that had ever popped up, including the alien races, like the Romulans and the Klingons, even though they weren't monsters. And it showed more typical monsters, like the Mugato and the Gorn, which were still sentient, but it's a friggin' T-Rex. And it showed things like the Entity and Red Jack and all those. And while it didn't cover as much about the characters, it did, in the first chapter, say, this is who Spock was, this is who Scotty was, this is who Kirk was, this is McCoy, Uhura, etc. And so many of those episodes in the book featured around Spock either being attacked by it or figuring out how to stop it, etc. Or giving Kirk the idea or implementing Kirk's idea. So Spock was very pivotal because he was one of the big three. I never knew about McCoy. That just shows you, and that's really a shame to drift off to Deforest Kelly for a minute, that for as big a role as he had, outside of Star Trek, no one has a fucking clue who he is. Because remember, when I said I knew Kirk, Scotty, and Spock, that was from someone who wasn't into Star Trek at the time. Those are the names. Like if I said, hey, McCoy, you're going to think, who's McCoy? Uhura, what the hell does that mean? Sulu, what's a Sulu? Chekhov. Chekhov what? Scotty, oh, beat me up, Scotty. Kirk, oh, Captain Kirk. Spock, oh, I know who Spock is. Those are the pop culture ones. And to be fair, the other characters have never reached that level. Like, I can say Picard, and you probably won't know who I'm talking about, or Riker, or Troy, or Cisco, or maybe Worf, or Dax, or Archer, or Janeway. You're not going to have a fucking clue, but I say Spock, Kirk, Scotty, you know. That just shows you the level to which Nimoy infected the popular culture, is the fact that I can go up to anyone and ask who Spock is, and they'll probably know. Nowadays, they might know the new Spock, but and as another topic shift here, I have not seen the new Star Trek movies, either one of them. But I am very thrilled, especially now that he died, that Nimoy liked the new Spock enough to basically officially patch the torch to him. That he has someone that he personally approved of as, yeah, I could see him playing the new Spock. And as another topic shift, within the topic shift, The reason I haven't seen the new movies doesn't have to do with, oh, they're changing time, or oh, they're retconning shit. That is a factor, but that's not the factor. And I feel bad mentioning this in the video that it's in, but the reason is I never particularly cared for the Kirk era. I didn't, you know. And if I don't want to see, if you give me a chance to watch any Star Trek, I'm gonna go with Deep Space Nine first, then Enterprise or the Next Generation, then it's a toss-up between Voyager and Kirk's era, depending on my mood at the time. Like, maybe I'm in the mood to see some old school shit. I want to watch Kirk fight the Tholians, or Spock fight the Tholians, effectively. Or I want to see, because I will also give one thing, Star Trek had some really cool creatures, monsters, whatever they are. It had some good ones. And if I don't care about the show when it's Shatner and Doohan and Nimoy and Kelly and Koenig and Nichelle Nichols and George Takei, if I don't care about it when it's them, what the fuck am I going to care about these strangers who are, for all intents and purposes, pretending to be the other characters, you know? And I'm not saying they're bad at it. For all I know, they're amazing. For all I know, they nailed all those roles where you could not know what you're watching and go, oh, that's definitely Chekhov. That's absolutely Sulu. I don't know this. I haven't seen it. And I'm not passing judgment basing on that. And I'm not passing judgment at all, really. I just don't care. You know? Like, if it were a reboot 20 years down the line of Deep Space Nine or The Next Generation or Enterprise or even Voyager, I'd watch because I cared about those casts. And I'm not saying that the original series is unimportant, because it was probably the most important thing. Our culture, as it is today, would not be without Star Trek. And people hear that and they laugh, but it's fucking true. This laptop that I have on my chest right now, because that's how I record, I lay down, plop this thing on my chest, and talk into the microphone. This would not exist if Kirk didn't have one. The cell phone that I'm holding in my hand right now that I use to time myself for an hour for This Week in Kyrix exists solely because Kirk would pull out this little thing, flip it open, Kirk to Enterprise. That's not an exaggeration. A guy who worked in a phone company saw that and is like, I have to make that. I have to make that real. The Bluetooth is Nichelle Nichols' Uhura's earpiece from the comm station. Medical technology exists because people wanted McCoy's sickbay. You know? Touch screens, Star Trek. The iPad, Star Trek. I had a Kindle years ago. I accidentally leaned against a railing while it was in my pocket and shattered the screen, but I still have it. But my Kindle, you can ask my friends if you ever find them. There were times when I would sit there and look at this thing and just grin, and they're like, what is it? I'm like, I'm holding Star Trek technology in my fucking hands. Do you not see how amazing this is? And that's the tragedy of it. We don't see how amazing this is. When you look at your Kindle, oh, it's just a boring book. That's a goddamn miracle in your hands. In the 60s, if I were to come back with a Kindle, they'd think I'm some god from the future. That's a fucking miracle in your hands. That's every book in the world in the fucking palm of your hand. That is Star Trek shit. And if you deny that, watch The Next Generation. The pad is an iPad. It's a fucking Kindle. And all of this exists because of Gene Roddenbury creating into Star Trek. And Shatner and Nimoy and all of them making them, selling them, making you think they're real. I heard a story once. I don't remember if it was for a movie or for a building or whatever, but they contacted the Star Trek people and asked them, dude, how did you make those moving doors? You know, the doors that we all take for granted right now, the magical doors where you step on a thing and they open for you? How did you make those? Oh, well, those are two guys standing with ropes that pull the door open while we make a swish sound. But that's real now, too, because of Star Trek. I'm not gonna go out on a limb and say that Star Trek mostly ended racism, but it played a part. This is something maybe you don't know, but Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura, didn't want to be in the show after the first season because she was a glorified secretary and she hated it. And she was gonna quit the series after the first season when it finished filming. And she was at a flea market, I believe it was, and happened to run into Dr. Martin Luther King. And he talked to her like, "Oh, I'm a big fan of your work, etc." And she's like, "Well, I'm going to quit." And he's like, "No, you can't do that. You're too important. You are the symbol when black people watch Star Trek and they see you're there. And even though you don't have a big role, you have a role. And no one says, 'Oh, let the black lady do it.' They just treat you as a person. That is the most important thing for people to see that and realize that that can be." And I've also heard a story, I think Nichelle Nichols told it, where, as she put it, there was this little black girl watching TV and she saw Uhura and she just runs screaming in her room, "Mommy, Mommy, there's a black woman on TV and she ain't no maid." And that woman grew up to be Whoopi Goldberg, who herself got on Star Trek. And Star Trek almost didn't happen because Gene Roddenbury wanted to change the status quo. He wanted to have episodes about racism and hatred and war, and they didn't want to let him do it, and he got his way. And Gene Roddenberry is another case where I love the man for what he did, but Star Trek got better after he died. Because he wouldn't let conflict exist the way it was supposed to the way to really deal with it. He was comparable to Worf, where Gene Roddenberry and Worf have this idealized mindset of what their species is, where Worf thinks Klingons are all like the Kalis of legend. And Roddenberry wants the Picards and the Kirks Enterprise era thing, where humanity's this perfect thing. When the reality is, those are what you aspire to, but you can't always be that. Sometimes you've got to do the unpalatable stuff, Which is why I like Deep Space Nine, is there is still that sense of hope and optimism, but the show gets dark sometimes. Really dark. And Sisko does some questionable shit, but he's my favorite captain because he does that questionable shit, acknowledges that it's wrong, but also that he really doesn't have a choice in the matter most of the time. There was the whole Maquis thing with Eddington, but I've never liked the Maquis, and I tend to blur those episodes out of my brain. But back to Nimoy. Without Nimoy, there would be no Data. There would be no Doctor. There would be no, to an extent, I guess Odo would be the one from Deep Space Nine, and there definitely wouldn't have been T'Pol. He set the standard, and also 7 of 9, he set the standard for the one oddball on the crew who either wants to be human or is so inhuman. Like, Data was the Spock of his era. You can make an argument that even though he didn't try to be human, he tried to be humanoid. Odo was the Spock of Deep Space Nine. The Spock of Voyager, even though they had a Vulcan, he was more the Worf. Voyager Spock was tossed up between the Doctor and Seven, who were, by the way, the best characters in the series. People who hate that series admit, yeah, the Doctor and Seven were pretty cool. And Enterprise had T'Pol, the Vulcan science officer. They went back to square one with that. So Nimoy set the archetype for Star Trek. Also, Nimoy was a big part of the movies that I loved, which was, I loved The Voyager Home, because that was just, it was a fun, happy story with time travel in whales. Plus, it had a bird of prey, and I've always liked the cloaking ships. And then it had the Undiscovered Country, which I think, every time I hear the Wrath of Khan, I'm thinking, no, the Undiscovered Country was the better movie, because it dealt with the final reconciliation between humanity and the Klingons. And it dealt with Kirk coming to terms with his demons with the Klingons, because they murdered his son. I mean, they'd always been his enemy, but they killed his son. And at the end of the movie, he and Spock had a conversation, basically, where Spock apologized for volunteering Kirk for this mission and how wrong it went. And Kirk's like, "I was so blinded by my hatred of the Klingons for what they did to my son that I just let this happen." And he just makes the mention that, have we gotten so old that this is what we are now, that we just can't change? And in the end, they do. They do come to terms with everything. There's a great battle in space between the Enterprise, the Excelsior, and Chang's Burrell, which was also a passing of the torch thing, saying, look, we're done. The Enterprise has had its day, and this is the Excelsior. This is the new hero. This is the ship that will carry Starfleet in the future. And it does a good job. I want to point out the Excelsior was still in service as late as the Dominion War. So it may not be top of the line anymore, but that thing's got some staying power. Whereas you never... I think they broke out some Constitution classes from the museum, but they weren't actively in service. So... But Nimoy was a huge role. He and Kirk were the majority of that movie. And then there was the whole thing with unification, where he came to the Next Generation and they made a big deal about that. And then there's the fact that he was the narrator. Not so much anymore, for obvious reasons. But he was the narrator for Star Trek Online as well. And he's got this great voice. I gotta wonder if he's done documentaries or nature documentaries, because I seem to recall him doing so. I know Avery Brooks does, and that man's got a voice to him. But Spock has been a lot of things to a lot of people. To me, he was, let's call him one of the pioneers of Star Trek. Without him, the what we have today would not be. And I tell people this, that while I personally do not like, that's the wrong word. I was going to say I do not like the original Star Trek. I do not, and I hate this word, I do not prefer it. It's not, we've established, it's a third tier show for me in terms of Star Trek. It's the third thing I reach for. But I recognize their place in history. I respect their place in history. I do not argue that they were important. I argue that they were. I argue that they were arguably more important than just about any other show that exists. You know, because our society, and it's so weird to say this because it sounds so cheesy and people are going to roll their eyes. Our society would not exist as it does without Star Trek. The internet, cell phones, computers as they are, much less laptops and tablets, iPads, medical technology as we know it, you know, these are things that were all inspired by Star Trek, because they had a special how William Shatner changed the world, you know, which was a tongue-in-cheek thing. It was really about Star Trek, and it had William Shatner narrating it and acting, yes, acting, like, oh, I'm all high and mighty and such. And it talked with people who helped develop these things about how their inspiration to either become what they became or to make what they made was watching Star Trek. How many people became doctors because they wanted to be McCoy? How many people became engineers because they wanted to be Scotty? You know? Communications engineers wanted what Kirk and Uhura had to work with, and now we have it. You know? The reason that the Enterprise looks so stupid now is not the colors. It's the fact that they act like this is high-tech shit, when on my laptop right now, I promise you is more advanced than anything Kirk's Enterprise ran. The laptop, like I said, sitting on my chest right now, could do all the shit that Kirk's laptop did and play games at the same time. And I don't even have a good laptop, you know? My cell phone may not get the reception into space that Kirk's did, but it's probably got more advanced because I don't use it for such, but my cell phone can play music and take pictures. And Kirk could just transmit voice. You know? And my Bluetooth for my PlayStation 3 doesn't look as dorky as Uhura's did. And I don't have to sit that close to use it. So, this video should have been about Nimoy, but for me, Nimoy is Star Trek. He's a huge part of Star Trek, and you cannot talk about Nimoy without talking about Star Trek as well. And while I am upset that he's dead, I'm not as broken up about it as I'd be if it were one of the newer cast members who died. And not because I like them more, because in some cases I don't. Let's be perfectly honest, if the actor who played Chakotay had died, I wouldn't be broken up at all about it, because from what I hear, the guy's a grade A asshole to the fans. He wasn't happy about being on Star Trek. He was a dick backstage. He was a dick at conventions, from what I've heard. Whereas Nimoy was not. But the thing is, look at the picture that's sitting above my Larvitar here. I think that's 1921 to 2015. The man was like 83 when he died. He had a hell of a life. And he had a hell of a legacy. And he's even had someone to fill the shoes for him afterwards, both his own children and grandchildren, and I'm sorry I don't know the man's name, but the guy who plays the new Spock. So he doesn't really have a lot left behind that's unattended. Would that we all could leave this life like that, you know? So, yeah. Basically what I'm saying is he will be missed, he will be mourned, but it's not necessarily a sad thing because he got to basically get everything in order before he finally left. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what Spock and Star Trek has meant to me and, from my viewpoint, to the world itself. Needless to say, this would be a very different world and probably not a better one if Nimoy and Shatner and James Doohan and DeForest Kelly and Michelle Nichols, George Takei, Walter Koenig, Gene Roddenbury, if they hadn't done what they did, we wouldn't be where we are. So, I've been Kyrix, and I hope this hasn't been too boring or too insulting to some people, but thank you for watching. Goodbye.